Hello, people who are joining us. We're going to give folks another minute to get through all of the waiting room. Attendees are coming in through the waiting room as we speak. We're going to get started in our conversation in just 2 minutes. But welcome, everybody. And I'm really glad to have you here with us today. We have an excellent conversation ahead of us. And even in prep, we've been having a lot of fun. So we're here to have not only an important conversation with all of you, but an engaging and dynamic, very dynamic conversation with all of you today. So we're going to get started in just a minute. Thank you all for being here. Okay, so we're going to get started and let people keep coming in as they go. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to Connectors, where community and entrepreneurship collide, a conversation series created by Recast City. And I'm Ilana Prus, and I'm really excited to be here with you today. And we are here today to really figure out a topic of conversation, or to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart and really essential to all of our work. What is equity really? So my name is Ilana Prus. For those of you who I've met before, I'm the CEO and founder of Recast City. And I am here because I believe in the work that we're doing in communities. And I believe in the work that we are doing with people in our communities. Our work at Recast City is focused on downtowns and main streets, neighborhood main streets, and how we're bringing small scale manufacturing, product-based businesses into those areas, but really looking at how are we creating opportunity for more people to be in storefronts, particularly people who have been excluded in the past and have been underserved by those opportunities in the past as well as today. And so our Connector series is really a time for us to take a step back from the day-to-day of all of our work and have a conversation. There will be no presentations today. There will be no PowerPoints. Have a conversation together about some of the most essential issues that we're facing within our communities, within small business growth, within big business growth that we're all dealing with today. Our first event that we did back in April was about the fight against vacant storefronts. Today is about what is equity really, and the one that we will do in the fall will be about investing in women-owned businesses. Why did we pick this topic today? So our topic today is all about equity. And the main reason that we wanted to bring this to the forefront today is because it is, well, there's a bunch of different reasons. One is there's been a lot of conversation about equity over the last few years, and a fewer number of people doing anything about it. A lot of lip service and less action. The other side of it is that I believe, and it's really a base piece of our work at Recast City, that this has to be part of everything that we do. It has to be purposeful steps and purposeful questions that we're asking throughout all of our community development work. But there's a big difference between being able to say what it is and being able to act on it. So our conversation today is really going to be focused on the nexus between those two things. What is it? And what do we do about it? Because if we're just talking about it, the theories behind it, the concept, we're not acting on it. We're doing something, but we're not doing enough from my perspective. And so today we're also going to have the conversation about what does it mean to act on this? How do we show and not just tell? When we've done work with Recast City, one of the programs we run is called the Equitable Lending Leaders Program, where we're working with small business lenders. And one of the conversations that we have really in our second or third meeting with them is how do you define equal access versus equitable access? And when we talk about small business lending, it can get simplified in some ways, in more simply than other topics, right? If we're talking about equal access to small business lending, to me, it means that your small business lending already represents the demographic diversity of your community. not the idea of it, but the actual delivery of those small business loans. And equitable access means that you are investing additional resources in those parts of your population that have been historically excluded or underserved, or currently are. And so when I come at this, and when we come at this conversation today, we can start from that, but obviously we're going to take a much bigger picture of all of this. So I'd like to introduce our two speakers for today. Enough for me and enough of a framing of this conversation. First, I'm going to introduce Skyra Rideaux. Skyra is the owner and principal consultant of Skyra Rideaux LLC. She's an equity consultant, inclusive economic development expert, and a climate and environmental justice activist with more than a decade of expertise in equity, sustainable development, and its connection to the fourth industrial revolution. And she can tell you about things like blockchain and AI and machine learning that I know nothing about. Even cooler in many ways, Skyra is a former bomb builder for the US Navy. She currently serves as a senior diversity, equity, and inclusion expert for a Fortune 10 global tech company, aligned to VPs leading $100 million plus businesses. And as a DEI lead, Skyra's areas of expertise are DEI strategy development and execution, data analysis, strategy alignment, executive leadership coaching, and talent management and DEI integration. There are so many cool things that Skyra has done, and maybe she'll talk about them some, but she did give a very cool TEDx talk called The Courage to Be Unapologetically Black, which is unbelievable, and has published with IEDC and worked with NASA, and is really one of the best co-conspirators out there, I have to say. Our second speaker is Jason Foster. Jason Foster is the president and chief operating officer of Destination Crenshaw. In this role, Jason is responsible for the administration and operations of the nonprofit, construction of the project's parks, open space, and infrastructure, and the organization's finances. And he serves as the organization's point of contact for public agencies and key community partners. That is an understatement. Let me just be clear about Jason's role in all of this. We will get into that, but that is the most understated description of what Jason actually does. Jason holds a BA in business administration finance from Howard University, is a member of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, and a founding member of Beta Chapter Alumni Association and the Beta Chapter Investment Club. Jason also holds an MBA from the Metropolitan College of New York, where he focused his studies on community redevelopment and small business incubation. And he lives in South LA with his wife and two children, and is proud to have grown up in Knoxville, Tennessee. And just before we all got on, we realized that I've worked with Jason's mom in Knoxville, Tennessee. So we're all here, and we're really excited to have this conversation with you. And thank you for being along for this ride with us. So I'm going to open the conversation and stop talking. Jason and Skyra, what does equity mean to you and your work? I know, a small question to start with. Who wants to start?
You go, Jason. I'll follow you. I'll fast follow.
There's no way I'm going ahead of somebody who's built a bomb, right? so I think I am going to defer, and I think this is a good example of what equity is, right? Because a lot of times we do have conversations where we're talking about the leadership of women and what men need to do, right? So if we're talking about equity and we have two women and one man, and the man goes first, that is wrong, right? So I think what I want to do is model, kind of our philosophy at Destination Crenshaw and defer, right? And allow Skylar to actually go first, and then ultimately kind of support her in whatever she does.
I love it.
Wow. Okay, right. Skyra, all you.
Let's do it. So I want to start off by saying, like, when I think about equity, and this is like from the lens of both the work that I do and moving through the world as a Black woman, I think we have to disrupt and shift the mental models of how we think about DEI work. We tend to other this work, right? And I think of it as the core function of justice for all, for everyone. And I mean all, white, male, women, non-binary, disabled, veteran, Latino, old, fat, immigrant, poor, every single person. That's what it means. It's justice for all. And so when I think about equity specifically in the lens of DEI, I think of equity as an outcome. We tend to try to make these cutesy little things like equity is like picking the song at the dance. No, equity is an outcome. We have to be very specific and very clear, because if we're not, we won't get to the end game of what we're looking to get to. Okay, so equity is an outcome, either a space, and that space can be a community, it could be a workplace, it could be your home, it could be where you play, right? Either a space ensures that people have the tools and resources that they need to exceed, they have their needs met, whether those are employment or social or community needs, and they do not experience abuse, discrimination, or mistreatment. That is what equity is, right? And for every dimension in which it is lacking, we must understand and work together to understand the nuances of why and problem solve until it's achieved. So when I say equity is an outcome, you know what that means? It can be measured. It is not some nebulous thing out in the universe that we're just talking about. It is something that can be measured. So it is also the measured experience of an individual, interpersonal, and organizational success and well-being across stakeholder populations. And however you decide to break down those stakeholder populations is up to where you're doing this work, right? And we want to make sure it's the absence, again, of discrimination, mistreatment, or abuse. So these are things we can measure and things we can track. For me, when we're talking about corporate measuring and tracking, we can measure retention, we can measure promotions, we can measure employee relations and escalations, trust, engagement, through tools like surveys, roundtables, focus groups, having discussions with people one-on-one. So I look at equity as a measured outcome of the individual experience based on the environment in which they are in. And we measure it based on the sentiments of the people who are in that environment. So that's how I tend to view equity and how it kind of works for me in the work that I do.
Fantastic place to start. Thank you, Skyra. I love focusing it not on just on an outcome, but on a measured outcome.
Yes.
Jason.
Yeah, so I think the way I define equity is the overcompensation for the oppression and disinvestment for the equal amount of time. Because I think a lot of times, when we talk about equity, it tends to be marketing, right? So that's what Skylar was talking about. It's not actually actionable, right? And then ultimately, people think they're done after the first action, right? And a lot of times, the forgotten notion is we're actually trying to accomplish equality, right? So equity is what you do to make up for what hasn't happened, right? Yep. So the acknowledgement that we're actually starting from a deficit in all these conversations, it is only and all about redistribution of power, access, money, privilege. That's what we're actually doing, is exchanging them. I think being a finance person allows me an opportunity to kind of see the absolute value of things, right? So a really strong negative is just that number. It doesn't necessarily have to slide the scale either way. So it really means that, are you able to take less while other people get more? And so how do we have that conversation and then ultimately base it in time, right? Because if you can only do that for a week or 30 years, like Ivy League schools, then you kind of push to a situation where you're sacrificing the ability to actually have the equity conversation, because ultimately you don't want to do it for the amount of time that it takes to accomplish equality in this space, right? So equity is the roadmap, right? It's what we need to do, but it's ultimately a point to an end, right? And we're on this march and on this step, but it's all about are you willing to take less? And are you willing to have people that haven't had it and watch them have it while you have less, right? And that is ultimately the conversation that we're having. And I love the non-black and white framing of it, right? It is really about privilege, it's about caste, it's about affluency, it's about how people can have perceptions of privilege and affluency, but not actually have it. And I think ultimately it's about information and education around what's actually needed, what is enough, and ultimately reaching that line a little bit sooner than you would normally do it, and try to have that line come up for other folks.
Jason, I'm so glad you talked about sacrificing, watching others get more while you have less. And I think a lot of times what we don't do is, when we're having a conversation about equity, pair that with capitalism.
Oh yeah.
We have to decouple ourselves from capitalism in order to get to liberation and equity. There is no way that we're going to get there if we're not decoupling ourselves from capitalism. Now, listen, let me be very clear. I am not saying that we're going to design a system in which capitalism doesn't exist. It is a construct that we currently live in, but we can start to take the steps to make sure that we have an economic system, which we've had in the past, bartering, anyone remember that? Trade, remember that? We have to decouple our participation in, our benefits from, and the harm that is done through the tool of capitalism. And if we aren't willing to do that, if we aren't willing to look at ourselves and say that we are actively participating in the harm and the oppression and the destruction, specifically of Black and Brown peoples in the global South, if we aren't willing to have that honest conversation, then we should just stop talking about it. We should stop talking about it.
It's an amazing and enormous point, right? We have this conversation all the time about, I'm going to take us to storefronts because that's where my brain jumps immediately, right? When we think about real estate ownership and who owns the real estate and wanting real estate value to go up, right? That's inherent to the capitalism base you're talking about, Skyra, where in fact, with community development and creating more equitable outcomes, in many cases, we want to control. In some cases, we want to control the value of a property. And in some cases, we do want to increase a property, the property value, depending on who owns it and what's the context of it all. So I think we're, at least I feel like we're just at the beginning of those conversations. I'm just at the beginning of those conversations with people of how do we look at who benefits as the priority, and that the dollar side of it comes after we decide who benefits from it, right? It's this whole question within real estate, highest and best use, right? My question is always, I'm sure you know this one, Jason, right? Like somebody throws out highest and best use, and I'm like, highest and best use for who? And to what purpose, right? So I think this is sort of, you're putting the finer language around these big ideas. So I want to take us out another step, right? We all work with people all over the country who agree in principle. And the thing that they come back to is, well, how do I place a priority on just one specific part of my population? How do I make that case to other people? How is that okay? What would you say to them?
You go first.
Yeah, so I think, thank you for that. So, I'm deferring. So I think, one of the things we did during COVID when we started up our DC Thrive work, we saw that, a lot of the PPP, the public funding, the private funding wasn't going to Crenshaw businesses. But then we started seeing the extra layer of coverage around Black women-owned businesses just not getting served at all, right? So like, yes, Black businesses were struggling to get access. And then you have this whole layer of stuff like, but even when they get served, Black women-owned entrepreneurs and micro business owners weren't getting any services. So we actually developed a program to focus on that, right? Like focus on the people with least privilege. And what that allows you to do is you generate solutions for everybody else, right? Like you have to go through the most challenges possible to reach those people. And then you actually build a workforce and a pipeline for the other solutions to actually benefit other folks just because you've worked harder. So again, in accomplishing equity, it's the overcompensation. So what we had to do is go through and actually develop every step along the way. So when people would reach us, if we have 7 steps and you only need 3, well, guess what? Your conversation's shorter. That's what privilege is, right? And then ultimately, if we have 7 steps, we need to develop all 7 of those steps to be able to get people through that ladder of engagement and ultimately to the services that are needed. And then we give that model, right? Because ultimately that is actually how we find the least privilege. So I think for me, that's how we try to center our work, is really trying to identify those folks. It takes a little bit longer, right? But ultimately we know who those folks are, right? So that's why LA is trying to deal with homelessness, right? Like you could deal with building more housing, but how successful has that conversation been for Los Angeles in the past 10 years? You know, when you change the conversation to the people of least amount of privilege, which are people in houseless situations, look at what's happening, right? Because not only are you having a conversation around building new housing, you're having a conversation around keeping people in their house, which I think is a critical conversation that we weren't able to have, but that's also on the way, right? So I think that there is a, you know, kind of a centraling on the people with least privilege and ultimately the people that need the most support, and having that be your compass.
I love that. I think, yes. I want to start with something you said, Alana, and then jump into answering this question. So you were talking like, government policy always comes to mind because I've worked a lot in local government and policy and community development. And I think of the three things or conditions that usually exist when we're talking about community specifically. First, there's extraction. There's extraction of labor. There's extraction of resources. There's extraction of excess. Then there's destabilization. Not only are we extracting these things from you, we're going to destabilize your community assets, the unity within, like the cohesion within those neighborhoods and communities and peoples. And then it leads to genocide. There's a death, whether that's a death of the community, whether that's a death of the people, whether that's a death of wealth, right? So those are the three things. We extract, we destabilize, and then there's a genocide, right? So when we're talking about how do we identify population groups, a lot of people talk a lot about data. And I say that because like the company I work for, tech is like very, very, very data driven. And here's the thing that I want to make sure that I say about data. Data is not neutral. It's not neutral. It's not objective. It is very subjective. It is very biased. It is very racially driven. I don't care how many people try to tell you that it's not. It is. And it also is very dependent on who's interpreting it, why they're interpreting it, and who stands to benefit based on their interpretation of it. So we have to be very, very careful how we use data when we're talking about identifying population groups. Now, I'm not saying we don't use it at all, because data can be a great tool and it tells us where to start. It can tell us where to start. But for me, when we're talking about identifying groups or identifying like populations, I want to talk to the people. At the end of the day, we've formed some sort of hypothesis. There's some sort of outcome we're looking for. Based on that, who are we talking to? And what do they want? What do they need? How do we decentralize and democratize the process and give people agency? I hate the word empower. Swear if I can just remove it from the English dictionary, I would, because saying that we have the right to empower people implies that we are the one with the power and we're giving it to someone else. Empowerment is a state of being. People are already empowered. We are either getting in the way or we are pushing air in their sails, right? That is it. Empowerment is a state of being. We don't have the right to give it to anyone. So anyway, all that to say, when we're talking about identifying population groups, I like to start with, I want to talk to the people. What is happening? What is going on? How do we give agency? I'll give you a couple of examples. I'll try to keep them quick. We know I can talk forever. One, when I lived and worked in Lafayette, Louisiana, which is my hometown, when you're talking about development in a neighborhood, right, or in a community, typically big box stores like Target are coming in and they're looking at a number of things, but mostly it's rooftops, average household income, ingress, egress. There's other things, but those are the main things that they're looking at, right? So when you're trying to develop a community that has historically been underdeveloped, as a matter of fact, intentionally been redlined, disinvested in, left to die, and you have a company that wants to come and invest, they're going to look at the sides of town that have higher incomes, higher rooftops, that are able to get in and out of the area. What ended up happening is in Lafayette was one of our councilmen convinced that Target to go into one of our lower income neighborhoods. It is now one of the top performing Targets in the country. Right?
Yep.
And they tried to convince them to put a super Target in. They were like, the data doesn't support us putting that in there. And now they are kicking themselves because they didn't do it and they're trying to figure out how to expand that store. Same thing happened with the Buffalo Wild Wings. Buffalo Wild Wings didn't want to go where the councilman was suggesting that they go because clearly there's a lack of restaurants in those areas. One of the top performing Buffalo Wild Wings in the country. Data does not always give us all the information we need to make a decision. And I will say this too, on the other side of that, working inside of government, I was in a meeting. I was randomly invited to a meeting, right? They were getting stimulus money from the government during the pandemic. And they were like, hey, we have all this funding. We know it needs to go to our Black and brown communities. We don't know what to do with it. That's not even my lane. Don't know why I was in that meeting. Clearly the only Black person in the meeting, I was invited. So here they are talking about what program can they implement? How are they going to disperse this funding? And I'm like, we give it to the people. We disperse the money by getting out of the way, and we give it directly to the people. Period. We don't need to create a program. We don't need to funnel it. We don't need to have people submit requests for grant access. We are a funnel. We give the money to the people, because who are we to dictate how this money gets spent in a neighborhood where we've never lived, where we've never visited, where people that we don't even know, right? And look at all of you in this room. None of you look like the people you're trying to serve. So stop playing in my face. Let's give the people the money. And I had one of the people on the call me afterward, and she was like, well, I've gone to school. I have a master's degree in urban development. Like, I don't understand why you're telling me that I don't have the knowledge and information to be able to give insight into how we should spend this money. So anyway, data, people, insight is going to be very different depending on who's in the room.
Yeah. And as much as I am a city planner by training, I believe that the history of being a city planner is so filled with people who think they know all the answers. It's really painful to watch. I love your point about data and data being biased, because I rant about economic impact analyses all the time, right? You're actually excluding like home-based businesses, solo entrepreneurs, which make an enormous impact in local community wealth, right? And the databases exclude them. So if any city is looking at big economic development impact analyses, they're missing all the details of what makes a real difference for people in their community. So I'm completely with you. I think
And
that
just,
there's
just to,
yeah, go ahead,
if
Jason.
I can add one point, that's the reason why we're doing the Crenshaw Creative Economy Report. Because Otis College has a creative economy analysis for the state, but that state report actually doesn't track barbershops and nail salons. It doesn't track culinary. It doesn't track, kind of the experiential marketing field, which, Black folks in LA created, right? Like, there's so much that, I think we weren't actually tracking in the traditional economic development analysis. So you see what Destination Crenshaw is going to create. My argument is that we're going to create probably 5-10x of that, because we're currently in an art renaissance in Los Angeles, centered around Black artists from this community. We're currently having Juneteenth celebrations of over 50,000 people with over 100 vendors who all go back to their house, right? So ultimately, those are people that are living in the community as well. And we know that our chief export in LA is Black creative capital. So we have to do a better job of actually quantifying that number. So that's where the data comes from is actually very important, right? Because ultimately, if you look at the state report, you're like, oh, wow, LA makes a little bit of money. No, if you look at the Crenshaw report, you see that the money is actually being made here. So how do we actually show that through our public infrastructure? How do we show that in the strength of our public schools, our broadband connection? How are we allowing people that are creative to work in their homes instead of going to the West Side because they actually need to download a PDF, right? Like, there are little things that if we don't connect and actually see the ecosystem developing, that we're just going to completely miss. And that's where the power is involved, right? Because ultimately, my mom is a planner, right? As you know. And the big thing about that is she was able to tell me when a stop sign was going to be there now, right? Like, it's those little conversations where you're like, what? I guess this is kind of dangerous, And then 3 weeks later, there's a stop sign there, right? There's somebody that was making that decision. Like, that was an intentional decision. And she kind of gave me a window to that world, right? So it allowed me to be able to say, like, okay, how can we not prescribe these things as a physician would and say, your community gets this, this, and this? Because a lot of times those decisions is like Dollar Tree, Family Dollar, Dollar Tree, instead of grocery store, right? And I think that's the kind of decision making that we're hoping to change, and then model that change for future investment for other places.
I love the model that you're building with Destination Crenshaw in so many different ways, from that, the details of which businesses get to be vendors at the events, right? I mean, I feel like I rant about this all over the place. It's an easy thing to do, but most places don't even think about it. They're not purposeful about it, and really doing it at this community neighborhood level, and in a way that is in fact literally bringing dollars into your community, right? I think is just an essential piece of it. And I think your point around the power of the decision making and the dollars, you know, why should a road in a different part of town get fixed if this neighborhood doesn't have broadband? Right? I mean, it's these baseline pieces that, I mean, I know everybody knows this, but I can't help say it sometimes. Like, people just accept our history and they're like, and it is infuriating. Okay, I will stop ranting. So look, today is a day of history making in a bad way, right? We have to acknowledge that affirmative action just got destroyed in colleges.
Yep.
We have current and historic decades of distrust and exclusion. How do you show your community that what you're doing is different? How do you show or tell the people that you're working to advocate for that this time is different? And before you answer that, I just want to let people know that you guys are welcome to submit questions through the Q&A button. I forgot because we jumped right into the conversation because I love talking to Skyra and Jason. But you guys are welcome to put questions into the Q&A whenever you want, and we'll start pulling from that as well. So, right, how do you show your community that what you're doing is different?
I mean, I think that's such a good question, Alana, like addressing decades and centuries of distrust and exclusion and then trying to regain the trust. I think as a society, we have at least conditioned ourselves to believe that communities are solely responsible for their conditions. Like, they are responsible, right? And as Jason was talking about earlier, when you're thinking about it through the analysis of institutional power, we can identify and unpack systems external to the community that create the internal realities for the people who live there and experience it daily, right? It has been a force that has been levied on them. It is not the result of them like just choosing that. So when we're thinking about distrust, like, we need to identify and analyze the manifestations of racism, right? Policy, intentional racist policy. And we don't undo that by doing policy, race-neutral policies. We do anti-racist policies, okay, intentionally. We have to learn from history, and we have to be willing to say the uncomfortable thing out loud. We did this, we did it intentionally. This is how we did it. This is who benefited from it. This is who was disadvantaged by it. And this is what the community has told us they want us to do to repair the harm that we have done for centuries. We got to start there. We want to maintain accountability, right? Organizing with integrity requires that we be accountable to the communities who are struggling with oppression that we have created, period. And we have to be accountable to them. And then we have to undo the racism. We have to undo it, okay? It's the single barrier to effective coalition building for social change is racism. And we look at it as a scary word. People don't want to talk about it, but it is what it is. We created this in this country, started in the 1600s. We literally created the way that we operate based on race. And so what we're going to have to do to undo it is acknowledge that we did that and use race to undo it. So that means we're going to have to talk about it. And then we're going to have to talk about how do we do differently? How do we think differently? How do we decentralize power? And how do we stop saviorism? Okay, this is not a savior complex. We're not going into communities to save them. We are repairing the harm that we have caused for centuries and generations. Full stop. Okay, there's no saving. People don't need to be saved by you. They need to be given the agency and the power to do what they know needs to be done for the communities and people in which they live. And I know people don't like to talk about reparations, but we got to talk about reparations because harm comes at a cost.
It's equity.
Harm comes at a cost, and we got to pay for it. Okay, yeah. And we have historical precedent for doing that. If y'all want to research what happened during the Holocaust, we paid for that. We literally paid slave owners when we established the 13th Amendment and we abolished slavery. We paid them. Okay, so we have historical precedent for that. And we have to interrogate our own anti-Black. We have to do our own individual and collective work and interrogate our anti-Blackness and figure out how we're going to repair from there. And the last thing I want to say, and I don't know how people are gonna feel about this, you have to know and understand that you have no right to trust. You have no right to trust, and you may never get it. And you still have to do the work anyway.
That's a big one.
Oof.
That
Oof.
is I feel like you did just drop the bomb on that one. You have no right to trust. Yeah. Right. Nobody owes me their trust.
So
I mean,
I've been
okay, Jason, all yours.
I've been writing notes this whole time. That's why you guys see me looking to the side, because I've really just been trying to nail in like a couple things that she's saying.
Yeah.
So I think like, what I put in the chat, and feel free to share it with all the attendees, is the ethics of care. It's kind of a philosophy that I started really thinking about when I realized that justice is highly violent and subjective, and thinking about that in my search for justice for my people, what I'd be willing to do to other people in order to get that, right? So in that kind of search, of course, as you do, you search for the logic of Black women, which they've already thought about all this stuff. In Black feminist thought, there's ethics of care and how that is beyond justice, because ultimately you have to bring in some sense of care, or you'll just wipe out everything, right? Like you'll just kind of go through and be on a hunger for right and wrong, power decisions. And so, in these kind of lenses, so to speak, it's like metrics around like how you do decision making, how you make these decisions possible. And ultimately, if you're able to do this and hit all of these things, then you care. Because ultimately, that is what the question is, right? So a lot of times it's like, so we talked about Knoxville, Tennessee. When I was graduating high school, right? Like my last year there, I wanted to be senior class president. Not because I cared about being president of my high school, I cared about going to college, right? Now, people voted for me to do that, not because they cared about me being president, because they knew that I cared about going to college, right? Like it's ultimately that conversation was about, do you care about me going to this? Right? Because they weren't going to college. This was Strawberry Plains, Tennessee. They were technical graduates. They were working on cars and doing other stuff, right? Like they didn't care about that. That was not their path. But ultimately, it was showing some sense of care and vulnerability around the topic. And I think that that's really what our communities struggle to do, because a lot of times our vulnerability is weaponized for actions, right? So we're weaponized in protest, we're weaponized in distraught nature. So it's really hard to show vulnerability when it's actually something you care about, right? And we're also taught and I'll speak for myself as a man, like we're taught that, that emotion is needed, right? Like that's not our strength. Our strength is in being a widget and kind of banging stuff. So I think in order to move stuff forward, we have to show a sense of care, but also, the ability to see something that is not yours succeed. And how powerful it is to surrender in that nature, and ultimately move the stuff forward.
I love that sense of care as the way to center a lot of this and that vulnerability. I think it is part of it is willing to care about someone and something that you have no experience in, you have no knowledge of, and admitting that you're coming from a place of no knowledge and no history and still caring, right? And like Skyra said at the end of her remarks, that nobody owes you anything, including trust. I think those are
which is hard. Like that's why I loved that one. That one's hard because I think a lot of people feel like once you check the box, that solves it.
Yep.
And I think that, but also on the vulnerability and care side, I mean, I think that, and I'm going to make us start talking about the actual implementation, the actions behind this work that go with this work. But I think a lot of times when people work professionally, there's a distance, right? There's a distance between my professional work and caring and vulnerability and all of those pieces. And what we're really talking about is that they are one and the same in doing this work. That it is the central part of doing the work. So one of the questions that came in, and everyone's welcome to ask questions in the Q&A. The way we have this structured as a webinar is we can't unmute people, so put all your questions in there, and I promise we're going to go through them. So we have questions coming in around how do you do this as a small nonprofit with limited resources? How do you? I'm going to add to their question, but really, you know, the question to me is how do you make the equity work central to your work on the exact same dollars you have of what you're doing. And if you want to talk about a specific project or a story from your work to illustrate that point, you're welcome to as well. Because I want to start talking about how we apply the ideas that we've been talking about into the actual work. And I want people to be able to walk away with, oh, they did it this way. So whoever wants to start.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, what helps us is be able to identify where our best role is. Sometimes it really is just the people that make the connections. Sometimes it's the person that does the work, right? I think that allows you to kind of free yourself up from feeling like you have to do everything. And then ultimately it puts people in the best position. And, you know, just acknowledge that it's not your space. You know, I think that's ultimately, I spend a lot of time trying to think about what we should not do. And people assume that we're doing a lot, but there's a lot more that people ask us to do every day. So just imagine if, you know, we were just in a position where we couldn't say no. So I think the place to kind of move to is, you know, as an organization that has people kind of using their services, you can actually focus in and become an expert. And I think that ultimately serves people better because it allows opportunities for other people to kind of step up.
I think we need to disavow ourselves of the idea that everything needs a nonprofit, number one. And we need to organize for the sake of care, as Jason was saying. So I think part of it is that when we're talking about equity is like, if we are building something for a community of people in which we have no lived experience, you need to ask yourself why. And really keep going until you get to the end of that question. Keep asking why. I think that that's super important because we have a lot of organizations that are led by people who are serving populations of which they have no experience, no cultural understanding or competency. And we, in the effort to do good, are causing harm. And we are perpetuating harm onto peoples. And we need to be very mindful of that, and we need to be very honest about it. And I think we need to talk a lot about power. I don't think we talk enough about power and power shifts. And ultimately, the idea is not for us to build a good program. The idea is for us to work ourselves out of needing this organization to exist in the first place.
Yep.
Period. That's what we're doing. We want to make sure that people are thriving and their communities are thriving in the ways that makes the most sense to them, not to us. We don't get to dictate what that looks like. So if I want to take my income tax refund and go buy me a $5,000 TV, mind your business. Okay? As Auntie Tab says, that's my business. I get to do what I want with my money. So I think we just need to be mindful of that. And then the other thing I want to talk about is sustained organizing. I think a lot of times we get tired. Okay, compassion fatigue is a real thing, and we have to stay rooted. If we're talking about building trust, that takes decades. You have to be willing to stand firm in this work for decades. Never earn trust, never get recognition, and never achieve your goal. If you are not willing to do those three things, then don't do it because you're causing harm. Full stop.
Every time you finish talking, I have no idea what I'm supposed to say next, Skyra.
Exactly.
Yes. I'm like ready to cry, but yes. You know, I'd love for you to each talk about something you did in your work that illustrates some of this. I know it's not about the projects, it's about the people, but a lot of our work is organized around projects to reach people. And I'd love to have you each share a specific thing you did in your work world that illustrates what we're talking about, what it was, how you guys did it, maybe some of the details about how you actually did that. Because there's a lot of questions about, there's a lot of limiting factors around all of this. There's policies, or there's federal policies or state policies. We just destroyed affirmative action, right? Like there's chaos in all of the stuff around us, and we still get this work done, right? So I would love for you to each talk a little bit about getting that work done. You can pick the example.
I gotta think.
Oh
All right.
yeah. So I'll jump in and give you some space. I think this is a daily practice. I think one of the things I learned when I switched from affordable housing advocacy to infrastructure is that the affordable housing advocacy, the action of it, it didn't serve me, right? So I think the careful thing is to identify what serves you as a person in this space, right? What burns you out is because you're not doing things that fulfill you, right? So you're just kind of pouring out of your cup, right? Nothing's pouring in from the work. These are the people and the things that you spend the most time in your life with. Has to refill you in order, to kind of keep going. Once I switched, I think the forward kind of vision of infrastructure work, of community development work, of ultimately that 10-year plan that Skyra was talking about, that actually fills me up, right? Because you have time to allow people to grow, right? Like in a critical situation in affordable housing, either you stayed in your apartment or you didn't. I met you on Tuesday. On Friday, are you in there or not, right? There is no time, right? So it's like, how quickly can you do this? There was not time for storytelling, kind of growth, ultimately the empowerment that we need as a societal change to be able to move it forward. So I think it's a daily kind of understanding and practice of every single day. Are you able to shift and change to ultimately kind of push out the goalpost a little bit more on like what the possibilities are, right? So how do you separate yourself from that immediate kind of struggle, detach from that and then kind of move forward?
Will you talk for a minute, Jason, about you guys are I'm not going to describe it well, but you guys have decided to put out the RFPs for the infrastructure work in a different way. You're building up the capacity of businesses from the community to actually do the work in the community. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's a really, really strong example of what are the actions, what does implementation really look like within the community?
Yeah, so currently right now we're in capital construction for Destination Crenshaw. It's around a $60 million project all in. Our biggest parklet, Sankofa Park, is around 40,000 square feet, amphitheater style, open air space. And that project's been in the works for almost 2 years now. So a year of that was underground. We have a global construction firm that's moving it forward with PCL. Our workforce development component, we have 73% local hire hours, 89% wages local, 14% Black workers, 3% women. We're crushing it. I think our board said, you know what, we could do more. And that's frustrating when you hear that, right? And it was for me. But I think a lot of it is just the realization that, there was something that we could do more. We could actually look at all levels of, our employment with our minority contractors and workers, right? Like we're hitting our workers really well. How do we actually get to the business owner level? And so we tried to do it with our second phase. That contract was too high because everybody's like, I can't bond. So if I hear that 100 times as a finance person, I'm like, let's figure it out, right? So we figured out, a couple options. We figured out that Destination Crenshaw could assume all the liability for the project, so our contractors wouldn't need to bond. And I think that that's a possibility for our governments, right? Because ultimately, if you're doing a $500 million project, if you really want to hire somebody local, you can actually add 2% of that contract on and take away the bonding needed in general, right? Like that is an insurance question. That's a liability question. That's a question of if you care or not, right? And then there are programs that are actually out there to actually help you bond that the city has already. And we're looking to partner with that program to ultimately socialize and market that program in a much different way. You know, have our branding be linked to a public institution so that ultimately there's more people in our community that can get these contracts. So what we're going to do is we're going to put our last 3 parklets in RFP. We're going to have information sessions where we're asking people, what are your barriers? We're going to get through those barriers with the project and ultimately build the parklets with contractors that are from our community, because that'll give us the opportunity to say we reached success at the business owner level as well as the worker level and the pre-apprentice, the pre-worker level, right? Because you also have to look at the disinvestment, right? So we have to actually build the pipeline for the 10-year plan that Skylar's talking about.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you for walking us through those details, because I think it's the minutia of what you are building and how you're building it is completely based in the priority of the people in the neighborhood, and not the timeline and not the politics and not everybody, well, I would say very few places have figured that out. So thank you for walking us through that, Jason. Skyra, you want to talk us through an example?
Yeah. When I worked at the city of Austin, so remember policy, right? It's my thing. One of the things that we implemented is we took an example and a model from Baltimore, and they call them resiliency hubs, right? So this is really designed around natural disasters and emergency response and community self-reliance. So I do a lot of work in sustainable development, climate work, which is around community self-reliance. And so what these resiliency hubs are they are located directly in the community. They're an access point for when natural disasters happen. So there's funding provided, there's refrigeration provided, they are used as shelters for people to be able to go to, and there's food. All these things are already at this community site, which is providing, like, it's the agency of the community to decide what their needs are, what do they need to get for the residents who live there, because they already know what people need, right? When we have natural disasters, people need to plug in their oxygen machines, they need cold storage for their food and their medication. We're not thinking about those things because people in affluent communities don't have to think about that when natural disaster strikes. It reduces the burden on local emergency response teams, right? So there's actually a component of resiliency hubs that actually pays people within the neighborhoods to go and check on people who live there, to go and conduct assessments on, like, if there was a natural disaster, what would you need to be okay for the next week? And how can we make sure that that is at the local center in the middle of the community? And it's supposed to be within a relatively walking distance, right? So there are multiple ones throughout the community. And that thing I was talking about when we're talking about agency, right? It decentralizes it. It does not require the government to come in and say, this is what we think you need. It allows the community to actually dictate and decide and say, this is what we need, this is what we're going to store. And we also have the resources to buy things in real time as we need them as well. So we actually presented that policy to council, and they funded it while I was at the city of Austin to start to implement resiliency hubs. And this was based off of, I'm sure y'all heard about ice storm and the fact that our power was out for long periods of time and people literally died as a result of that. So this policy was working to address numerous things on multiple levels for communities who are typically, genocide, are left behind during these natural disasters. And after we moved on, after 3 months, they are still in need. There are still things that those community and those peoples need. And so those resiliency hubs provide the opportunity for them to continue to provide ongoing services and support for the people who live there. So that was an example of something that we did while I was at the city of Austin.
I love that. And one of the things I want to pull out of what you said is that the people from the community were paid to go collect this information and talk to people.
Yes.
Right? And I think that level of detail, look, historically, we didn't pay people for doing any of that. And we didn't think through all the details, and we didn't. And so I want to pull out for everybody this, it's not just about the spaces. It's not just about the policy. It's not just about the strategy. And it's not even just about who we're asking to go do the work. It's about paying those people, compensating them for that work that is for the community, by the community. And I think that's an essential nugget in all of that.
And it was important for us too, Alana, that wage was a thriving wage. So it wasn't $12, it wasn't 15, it wasn't even 20. It was $25 an hour that they were paying people to go out and do this work.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal detail. Thank you for sharing that. We're almost out of time. These conversations always go so fast. I know that the three of us could keep going for hours, but we are going to wrap this up in the next couple of minutes. First, I'm going to ask you guys if you want to just say any closing remarks, but even before we get to that, I want to thank you both for your time, for your thoughtfulness, and for the work that you're doing day in and day out on this. You guys are the people I look up to about this work, and I really appreciate everything that you're doing and getting to learn from each of you and from so many other people in the field. So thank you. What do you want everybody to take away from today? If you have just a couple of minutes left, what's the thing you want to, the nugget you want to, not that we can boil equity work down to a nugget at all. I'm not saying that, but if there's one thing you want to make sure people are taking away from this today, what is it?
I know we talked about current state, and I think it's important for us to understand current state. That's really important. But I want us to remember, right, that even in the midst of current state, we have to recognize that the world is still spinning and things are still happening. And the speed in which current breakthroughs are happening right now in emerging tech has no precedent in history. So while we're talking about infrastructure and broadband, I know President Biden just released a bill where they're spending like $42 billion to expand broadband to every area of the country, which doesn't happen. Y'all, broadband was introduced in the early 2000s, and it's going to take them the next 7 years to ensure that every single person in this country has access. Meanwhile, we are already moving into digital currency. We're moving into blockchain technology, machine learning, generative AI. So can you imagine if people still don't have access to broadband? And this is just the ability to access broadband. They have no technology to be able to access the technology, okay? So like we need to start thinking further into the future now, because things are happening right now and communities are getting left further and further and further behind. And so while we have to recognize current state, we really need to be planning for what's going to happen in the next 5 years, because it's going to be rapid, it's going to be quick. And we need to make sure that people are up to speed on that.
Thank you.
Wow. So I'm super grateful for this conversation and the ability to just kind of learn. I think, so I would say two things. The first thing, money and finances are feeling before it's anything else. Pay attention to the feeling you have around things and the value that you assign to it. It says a lot about, not only what you feel about yourself, but ultimately what you feel about the things happening around you, right? Because there might be a lot of good work happening around you, but it feels like it's for someone else.
Mm-hmm.
That's a fundamental thing that you have to do, right? Or there's an organization in your community that's probably helping people that deal with that, right? So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, pay attention to what grief is and what it does and how it manifests. What are we grieving in our community? We're grieving the businesses that are no longer there. We're grieving the entrepreneurs that had to close their shops. We're grieving communities that are changing and losing their culture. Community has conversations that, then in turn sound like resistant conversations around improving. No, they're just a lack of acknowledgement on the grieving that's taken place and continues to take place. And I think that there's a way in which we can have these conversations and participate in them, to where we can intentionally make sure that people who are in communities are heard and ultimately they succeed. I think that's a decision. And so I think, let's not, the council member who, his vision was Destination Crenshaw, talks about the spiral of progress, right? Let's not get lost in this kind of backward part of the spiral, right? Because ultimately, if you're thinking about, correction and then an equal correction on the other side, this is not an equal correction. Where we are now is not an equal correction. So if we push here and then it comes back to here, we're going to push this way, right? So that's progress. That's the definition of progress. And so, I think, folks need to just kind of rely on people of least privilege. They'll tell you it's not a big deal. I was reading a lot of data about, the Black attendance at, Harvard and how it's gone up and what are the metrics for people getting into Harvard. I'm more concerned about the metrics of Howard, Hampton, Clark, Morehouse, Spelman, Johnson C. College, Fisk, Tuskegee, those places. How do we actually have more funding locked into those places, and actually update their amenities because they actually want them, right? And so let's actually think about this differently, right? Like you kind of, I think the honesty of their disdain for Black folks attending. Let's see where they are in 50 years, right?
Yeah.
See how that goes. But ultimately, come where you're wanted, right? And then in those places, we'll build community together, and then we'll be there to care for the folks when they need a hug in a couple of years.
I really appreciate your thoughts around not only going where you wanted, but invest the need and the requirement to invest in those places. And that it's an all-in kind of answer. So thank you both. Thank you is really not sufficient for what we just went through in this conversation, but thank you. And I hope everybody who has had a chance to join us today and listen in has had a chance to learn a lot too. But I know that this is a step in our ongoing conversations and in our ongoing work. So thank you for leading this step with us today. Everybody have a great day. Stay healthy and be true to all this stuff. Bye. Thank you.